Hi, and welcome to Ginger English. I'm Marcus, joined as always by Sarah, and today we have a B1 level podcast for you. Okay, so picture this. You're a regular guy. You teach math at a small town high school in Ohio. You grade papers, you drink your coffee, you mow your lawn on Saturdays. Life is quiet, predictable, fine. And then one Tuesday morning, just a regular boring Tuesday, a letter arrives from a lawyer. It says that someone you've never met, a distant relative you didn't even know existed, has died, and he left you something. Not money, not a car, a house in the mountains of Colorado. Now, how does that make you feel? Surprised? A little suspicious, maybe, because that's exactly how Mark Harris felt when he opened that letter at his kitchen table in Dayton, Ohio. He read it twice, then a third time. Then he called his wife in and said, "Jen, you need to see this." Mark was 41 years old. He'd never owned anything more exciting than a used pickup truck, and now apparently he owned a mountain house. Just like that. But here's the thing about unexpected gifts. They almost never come without complications. And this one came with a very big complication. Actually, not a complication, a person, but we'll get to that. Mark was a high school math teacher, solid, honest guy, married to Jennifer, Jen, a dental hygienist, small house, a dog named Biscuit, $30,000 left on their mortgage. The kind of couple that argued about whose turn it was to do the dishes and then laughed about it 5 minutes later. Normal, real. So when lawyer Gerald Whitmore from Denver wrote to say that one Raymond Ellis had passed away and left Mark a property worth around $240,000, Mark's first reaction wasn't joy, it was confusion. Who was Raymond Ellis? Mark called his mom. She went quiet for a moment, just a second too long, and then said, "Oh, Raymond. He was your grandfather's brother. They had a falling out years ago. We never talked about him." A falling out? Years ago? And now this stranger was giving Mark a house. Why? That question, why, is going to follow us through this whole story. And trust me, when you find out the answer, you're going to feel a lot of things at once. Mark and Jen packed a bag and drove from Dayton, Ohio, to a small mountain town called Ridgway, Colorado. 12 hours. One overnight motel stop, 2 large coffees, and one argument about the GPS. They pulled up to the house on a cold November afternoon. The mountains already had their first snow. The house was old, maybe 1950s, with a wide porch, dark wooden walls, and a chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Tired and forgotten, but beautiful in its own way. Mark walked up the steps. He had the key from the lawyer. He put it in the lock. He turned it, and the door opened. From the inside, a woman stood there, small, white-haired, maybe 78 years old, blue cardigan, cup of tea in her hand. She looked at Mark completely calm and said, "You must be Raymond's boy. I've been expecting you. Come in. I just made a fresh pot." Mark stood there frozen because nobody told him there was someone living in his house. Nobody at all.
So let's talk about Rosa, because that's her name. Rosa. Rosa Mendez. And the moment Mark and Jen walked into that house, Rosa took over. Not in a rude way, in a very calm, very confident, this is my home kind of way. She led them to the kitchen. The house was warm inside. Someone had been keeping that fireplace going just fine. There were plants on the windowsill, a knitted blanket on the armchair, a small black and white cat on the couch. The place didn't feel like an empty, inherited property. It felt like someone's home. Rosa poured tea like they were old friends stopping by. Jen looked at Mark. Mark looked at Jen. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Finally, Mark sat down. "Rosa," he said carefully, "how long have you been living here?" 11 years, she said. No apology, no explanation, just 11 years. Mark did the math. Raymond had been alive for at least part of that time. So Rosa wasn't squatting illegally, or at least she didn't think she was. "And Raymond knew you were here?" he asked. Rosa looked at him over her teacup. "Raymond invited me," she said. "We had an agreement." "What kind of agreement?" Jen asked. She's always been the more direct one. Rosa set her cup down. "He told me I could stay here for the rest of my life. He said this place would always be my home." She paused. "He was a good man. I trusted him completely." Now, here's where things get complicated. What Rosa was describing is actually a real legal concept. It's called a life estate, the right to live in a property until you die, even if you don't own it. But it has to be written down, signed, and officially recorded. Mark called the lawyer that evening. Gerald Whitmore checked everything. Every single document connected to the property. There was nothing. No life estate, no written agreement, no mention of Rosa at all. Legally, the house was 100% Mark's. He could ask Rosa to leave. He had every right. But Mark sat in that kitchen with his tea getting cold, looking at this 78-year-old woman who had built her entire life inside these walls, her plants, her cat, her blanket, her routine. And he couldn't say it. He just couldn't look her in the eyes and say, "You have to go." That night at the motel, Jen lay in the dark and said quietly, "Mark, what are we going to do?" And he had no idea. On one side, the money, $240,000. That's not nothing for a math teacher from Ohio. It could pay off their mortgage. Real security, maybe for the first time. But they couldn't sell with Rosa inside. Nobody would buy it. So if they wanted the money, Rosa had to leave. On the other side, an old woman in a blue cardigan, completely sure her home was her home. And here's the detail that really stayed with me. Rosa had nowhere else to go. No children, no family nearby. She'd lived in Ridgeway for over a decade. This house, this mountain town, it was everything she had. So I'm asking you directly, what would you do in Mark's position? Mark and Jen stayed in Ridgeway for 3 days. They told themselves it was to figure things out. But honestly, I think they just weren't ready to make a decision. Every morning, they drove back to the house. And every morning, Rosa had coffee ready. Strong, black, in big ceramic mugs, like she already knew what they needed. Slowly, without really planning it, they started talking. Not about the house, not about the legal stuff, just talking. Rosa asked Mark about his students. She asked Jen about her work. She told them about Ridgeway, which bakery had the best pie, which trail had the best view, which neighbors to avoid if you didn't want a 2-hour conversation about local politics. She was funny, sharp, a little sarcastic in a way that made you smile before you even realized it. Jen told me later, and this is the part that gets me, she said, by the second day, I kept forgetting why we were there. She just felt like family, and that made everything harder. On day 2, Mark finally asked the question he'd been avoiding. He waited until Rosa's cat, whose name turned out to be Pepper, had jumped onto his lap and fallen asleep there. And then he said quietly, "Rosa, can I ask you something about Raymond?" Rosa nodded once. "Why did he leave the house to me? He didn't know me. We never met. Why not leave it to you? Or at least make sure you were protected?" Rosa went quiet. She looked out the window at the snow on the mountain. Then she said, "Raymond had his reasons. He always did." And that was it. Nothing else. Mark didn't push, but he didn't forget it either. That afternoon, while Rosa was resting, Mark and Jen walked the property. Behind the house, there was a small barn, an old snow-covered garden, and a wooden shed locked with a heavy padlock. "What's in there?" Jen asked. Mark tried the key from the lawyer. It didn't fit. He tried again. Nothing. They stood there looking at that shed. And I know it sounds like a small detail, a locked shed, so what? But that padlock matters. What was inside is actually the reason Raymond left this house to a nephew he'd never met, instead of the woman living right next to him for over a decade. But we'll get there. What happened first was this. On the morning of day 3, Mark came to the house alone. Jen stayed at the motel. He sat down across from Rosa at the kitchen table, Pepper on the windowsill, fire going. And Mark said, "Rosa, I need to be honest with you." She folded her hands and waited. "I don't want to hurt you. I genuinely don't. But I have a mortgage, a life back in Ohio. And this house, I need to understand what I'm supposed to do with it." Rosa looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "There's something I need to show you. I was going to wait, but maybe it's time." She went to the back of the house and came back carrying a small wooden box, old, scratched, with a simple metal latch. She set it on the table between them. "Raymond gave me this," she said. "He told me to open it only if someone came to take the house." She paused. "Open it." Mark looked at the box, then at Rosa, then back at the box. He opened it.
Inside the box, there were three things: a letter, a photograph, and a small brass key. Mark picked up the photograph first. Black and white, slightly faded, two young men, maybe in their 20s, standing in front of a house, the same house. Mark recognized the porch, the wooden walls, the windows, but in the photo it looked brand new. Fresh paint, clean steps, a young tree in the yard that was now probably 30 feet tall. He turned it over. On the back, in faded pencil, two names, Raymond and Thomas. Thomas, that was Mark's grandfather's name. Mark set the photo down and picked up the letter. Handwritten, not typed, in small neat print. The paper was yellowed, but the ink was still clear. At the top, March 14th, 2019, about 4 years before Raymond died. The letter was addressed to whoever comes for the house, not to Mark specifically. Raymond didn't know who would come, but he knew someone would eventually, and he wanted to explain. Raymond wrote that he and Thomas, Mark's grandfather, had been best friends, not just brothers. They built that house together in 1958 with money they'd both saved for years, a shared place, a family place. But in 1963, something happened. Raymond didn't describe exactly what. He just called it a mistake I made that Thomas could never forgive. Whatever it was, Thomas walked away, cut all contact, never spoke to Raymond again, and Raymond spent the next 60 years in that house, alone, carrying something he never got to apologize for. Rosa, he explained, had moved to Ridgeway in 2012 after her husband died. A neighbor at first, then a friend. Then, and Raymond wrote this simply, without drama, "The only real family I had left." He made her a promise. He meant to make it legal. He kept putting it off, and by the time his health got bad, it was too late for lawyers and paperwork, so he did what he could. He left the house to Mark, not because he knew him, but because Mark was Thomas's grandson, because Raymond wanted the house to go back to the family it came from, and he hoped, he actually used that word, that whoever came would see Rosa for who she was and do the right thing. He wasn't ordering Mark to do anything, just asking, hoping, and then, at the end of the letter, one more line. "The small key opens the shed. Inside you'll find what you actually inherited. The house was just the way to get you there." Mark put the letter down. He looked at the brass key still sitting in the box. Then he looked at Rosa. She was watching him with the same calm expression, but this time her eyes were a little wet. "You knew what was in the letter," Mark said, not a question. "Raymond read it to me when he wrote it," she said quietly. "He wanted me to know." Mark picked up the key, small and cold in his hand. "The shed," he said. Rosa nodded. "The shed," and Mark stood up.
"Okay. The shed." Mark walked out the back door with the brass key in his hand. Rosa stayed inside. Jen was still at the motel, so it was just Mark, alone, crossing that snowy yard toward the shed with the heavy padlock. He told me later that his hands were shaking a little, not from the cold. He put the key in. This time, it fit. The lock clicked open. He pulled the door. Inside, it was dark and smelled like wood and something dry and papery. Mark found a light switch. A single bulb flickered on, and he just stood there. The shed was full of paintings. Not a few. Not a small collection. Dozens. Maybe more. Canvases of all sizes, stacked carefully against every wall, wrapped in cloth, some framed and some not. A work table in the center with dried brushes and old paint tubes. An easel in the corner with a half-finished canvas. A mountain landscape, snow on the peaks. A narrow road disappearing into trees. Raymond Ellis had been a painter, and from the look of it, a serious one. Mark started carefully unwrapping canvases. The work was beautiful. Landscapes mostly, mountains, rivers, fields in different seasons, but also portraits. Quiet, intimate scenes, an old man reading by a window, a woman hanging laundry in summer, a child feeding ducks at a pond. And then Mark found something that stopped him completely. A portrait of two boys, young, maybe 10 and 12, sitting on the front porch of the same house, laughing at something off to the side. You couldn't see what was funny, you just felt it. The whole painting had this warmth, like the laughter was still alive inside the canvas. At the bottom, in small, neat letters, Brothers. 1951, Raymond had painted his brother, the person who stopped speaking to him, and he'd kept that painting for over 70 years, locked in a shed, wrapped in cloth. Mark sat down on the cold wooden floor and didn't move for a long time. He called Jen. All he said was, "You need to come see this." She heard something in his voice and didn't ask questions. She was there in 15 minutes. They spent the rest of the afternoon going through the paintings one by one, carefully, quietly, like reading someone's diary. Later, Mark called Gerald Whitmore and described what he'd found. Gerald went quiet. Then, Raymond tried to sell some pieces about 10 years ago. A gallery in Denver was interested, but he pulled out at the last minute. Said he wasn't ready. A pause. I always thought that was strange. He clearly needed the money. Mark looked around the shed. Gerald said he didn't know the full value, but he knew an art consultant who could come in, look at everything, and give them a realistic picture. A realistic picture. Mark was still getting used to the whole thing. A week ago, he was a math teacher with a dog and a mortgage. Now he was standing in a shed full of paintings by a man he never knew. He locked up, slipped the brass key into his pocket, and went back inside to Rosa.
The art consultant's name was Diana Reeves. She drove up from Denver 2 days later, a tall woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a very no-nonsense way of looking at things. She spent 4 hours in that shed. 4 hours. Mark and Jen waited inside with Rosa, drinking coffee and not saying much. Rosa just knitted, calm as always, like she already knew how the story ended. When Diana finally came back inside, she sat down at the kitchen table and looked at Mark very directly. "Mr. Harris," she said, "do you have any idea what's in that shed?" Mark said he didn't. Diana nodded slowly. Raymond Ellis was not a famous artist. He never showed his work publicly, never sold through any major gallery, but the work is exceptional, technically strong, emotionally rich, consistent across decades. In the right market with the right presentation, she looked at her notes. I'd estimate the collection at somewhere between $300,000 and $450,000, possibly more. The room went quiet. Jen made a small sound, not quite a word, just a sound. Mark looked at his coffee cup, then up. What about the house? Diana shrugged. $240, $250, but the paintings are the real inheritance. After Diana left, the three of them sat at the kitchen table for a long time without speaking. Pepper jumped up and settled in the middle like he was part of the meeting. Finally, Mark said, "Rosa, did you know what the paintings were worth?" Rosa was quiet. Then, "I knew he painted. I knew the shed was full. He never let me inside. He was private about his work." She looked at her hands. "I knew they were beautiful. I didn't know about money." Mark believed her. "I think you would have too." And then Jen, quiet, steady Jen, who'd barely said 20 words the whole trip, put her coffee cup down and said something that changed everything. "Mark, what if we don't sell the house?" Mark looked at her. "What if we keep it?" she said. "Fix it up. Rosa stays." She paused. "The paintings can cover the mortgage, and more. We could come here in summers. We could actually—" She looked around the kitchen, at the plants, the fire, the mountains through the glass. "We could actually have a place like this." Rosa looked at Jen. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't say anything. She just reached across the table and put her hand over Jen's. Mark sat back. He looked at his wife, at Rosa, at the mountains outside. and something shifted, like a decision that had been sitting heavy in his chest just released. "Okay," he said quietly. "Let's talk about what that looks like." Nothing was solved yet. Still practical questions, legal questions, money questions. Nothing simple, but the direction was clear, and sometimes that's enough to start. So here's what happened next. And I want to be clear, this wasn't a clean Hollywood ending where everything worked out perfectly. Real life doesn't work like that. Mark and Jen drove back to Dayton. They needed time to sit in their own house with their own dog and actually think. That took about 2 weeks. Mark talked to Gerald Whitmore almost every day. They worked through the legal side, what it would take to formally give Rosa the right to stay, how to do it properly this time, with actual documents and actual signatures. The thing Raymond couldn't manage in time, Mark was going to do it right. He also talked to Diana about the paintings. They decided to go slowly, not a big auction, not a rush. Diana suggested approaching a few private collectors first, people who would treat the work with respect. Mark agreed. These weren't just assets, they were someone's life's work. The first 2 paintings sold within a month. Together, just over $60,000. Mark used part of that to pay down a large chunk of their mortgage. For the first time in years, that number didn't feel impossible. He used another part to hire a local contractor in Ridgeway, a guy named Pete that Rosa recommended, to fix the roof, update the heating, and repair the front porch steps that had been quietly rotting for probably a decade. Rosa supervised every bit of it. Apparently, she was very specific about the porch. And then came the moment I keep coming back to, late January. Mark and Jen drove back to Ridgeway, not for lawyers or contractors, just to visit. They brought Biscuit, which Rosa had specifically requested after hearing about him. They pulled up to the house, new porch steps, smoke from the chimney, Rosa standing out front in her blue cardigan, holding Pepper, watching them arrive. Mark got out. Biscuit immediately lost his mind, jumping, spinning, tail going like a helicopter. Rosa laughed, a real laugh, loud and surprised. Mark said it was the first time he'd heard her laugh like that. They went inside. Rosa had made soup. The house smelled like wood smoke and something warm on the stove. Mark sat at the kitchen table, his table now officially, with Rosa's right to stay signed and notarized and filed in 2 offices, and felt something unexpected. He felt like he'd done something right, not perfect. Raymond's secret, what exactly happened with Thomas in 1963, was still a mystery, and probably always would be. That gap in the story wasn't going away, but the house was taken care of, Rosa was taken care of, and somewhere in a Denver gallery, a painting called Brothers, 1951 was going to hang where people could finally see it. Raymond spent 60 years locked away from his family, but he'd painted his way through all of it, and now someone was paying attention. Mark looked around that kitchen, Rosa quietly feeding Biscuit a piece of bread when she thought no one was watching. Jen laughing at something on her phone. Pepper on the windowsill in the winter sun. He thought, I never met this man, but somehow, he knew exactly what he was doing when he sent me that letter.
So that's the story of Mark Harris, Rosa Mendez, and Raymond Ellis. A man who spent 60 years alone with his paintings and his regrets, and who somehow, in the end, managed to bring a family back together. A family that didn't even know it needed finding. I've been thinking about this story a lot since I first heard it. And what stays with me isn't the money, not the paintings, not the house value, not the mortgage math. What stays with me is that letter. Raymond sat down in 2019, knowing he was getting older, knowing he hadn't made things right, and he wrote a letter to a person he'd never met. He didn't know if that person would be kind or cold. He didn't know if they'd read it carefully or just call a real estate agent. He had no way to control any of it. He just hoped. And I think that's the most human thing in this whole story. Not the conflict, not the legal drama, the hoping. The idea that even after 60 years of silence, 60 years of a broken relationship, and a house full of unseen paintings, Raymond still believed that somewhere out there was someone who would show up and do the right thing. And Mark did. Not immediately. It took him time. It took Jen. It took sitting in that kitchen and really seeing Rosa for who she was. But he got there. You know, when Mark told me this story, and yes, I did speak to him, this isn't just something I read online. He said something I haven't been able to forget. I asked him if he ever wished he'd just sold everything quickly and gone back to Ohio. Clean break, simple math. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Every once in a while, I think about that version of the story. And then I think about Rosa feeding Biscuit under the table. And no, I really don't. That's it. That's the whole thing. Sometimes the right decision isn't the easy one or the logical one. Sometimes it's the one that lets you sit in a warm kitchen in the Colorado mountains with soup on the stove and a cat on the windowsill and just know that you chose well." I hope this story gave you something to think about today. Maybe about inheritance, not just money or property, but what people leave behind when they go. Their choices, their regrets, their small acts of hope. Raymond left behind a house, a shed full of paintings, and one very carefully written letter. That turned out to be enough. And on that note, if you enjoyed today's podcast, we would love it if you hit that like button and subscribed to Ginger English. It genuinely helps us reach more people, and every new listener means this little community of ours keeps growing. Share this episode with a friend who's learning English, or honestly, with anyone who just loves a good story. We'll be back soon with another B1 episode. Until then, take care of yourselves. And maybe, if you have an old letter you've been meaning to write, go ahead and write it. You never know who's going to open it.